So the story and history we're going to share today comes from the Unitarian Universalist Association's Curriculum and History web pages. You can go read more about them there. In particular, from a piece written by Reginald Zolati. As Diana described, the Flower Communion service was created by Norbert Chapek, who founded the Unitarian Church in Czechoslovakia. He introduced this special service that came to church in June of 1923. Norbert understood the people he served. He too was raised Roman Catholic in Czechoslovakia. He was an accolade in his youth, but he became disillusioned by the inconsistencies in what was said versus what was done by priests in his church. When living in Vienna as an apprentice to his uncle, a tailor, he resigned from the Roman Catholic Church when he was 19, and he was baptized as a Baptist. His religious impulse was strong, and he founded almost a dozen churches in Ukraine to Bucharest. He studied religion, and through his research, he found the history of a free Christian faith that he was convinced was native to his people. This faith, he discovered, had Bohemian and Moravian roots. He wrote a paper describing the roots of his faith as valuing the spiritual life above any religious dogma or teachings.
After years of leadership and participation in the International Association for Religious Freedom, which was founded in the 1900s by Unitarians, he left the Baptist ministry. In his diary, he wrote, "I cannot be a Baptist anymore, even in compromise. The fire of new desires, new words is burning inside me." 2 years later, in 1921, he and his wife Maya joined the Unitarian Church in Orange, New Jersey, where his grown children attended. Only a few years later, he and Maya returned to Czechoslovakia and started a school of religious science, which trained students for church leadership. He wrote curriculum on religious history and philosophy, which was taught in the Prague public schools. He was a leader in the religious movement in Prague, a city which had a Unitarian church with 3,200 members, the largest in the world at that time. He, along with a medical doctor, sponsored an extensive counseling program out of the church and classes for those experiencing grief, needing conflict resolution, marriage counseling, and support for newly expecting parents.
Chapek also served that small church that you've heard about on the outskirts of Prague. The building was simple and plain, as were their Sunday services. The inspiration for the Flower Communion came to him on a beautiful spring day like this, when the flowers were blooming and the world was beautiful. On that Sunday, people came with flowers of all different colors and sizes and kinds, flowers that filled the vases. And then the church wasn't so plain and simple anymore. He reminded the parishioners that flowers were like themselves, different colors, different shapes, different sizes, each needing different kinds of care, each important and special in their own way.
History says that it was during her tour of the United States that Maya introduced the Flower Communion in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maya was unable to return to Prague due to the outbreak of World War II. Chapek remained in Prague. He was an advocate for religious freedom and progressive education. His work was seen as a threat to the Nazis who occupied his homeland. He was picked up by the Gestapo and sent to Dachau, where he was killed. It was not until the war was over that Norbert Chapek's death in a Nazi concentration camp was revealed. That simple service, practiced in most UU congregations, is inspired by the sight of flowers surrounding that little church, full of people who recognize the gift of religious freedom. Like you, they found a religious home with theological diversity that was grounded in a call to genuine life of faith, hope, worship, love, and conscientiousness. The simple act of communion, which comes from the Latin root word of communionem, sorry if I mispronounced that, meaning fellowship, mutual participation, or sharing, was a radical act, and still is, in a dark time in history. We too must stay open, looking for ways to commune across differences and divides, and ways to celebrate that which is beloved and sacred.
I, like Michelle, love flower communion. I love the metaphor of flowers being brought here individually, coming together in these beautiful bunches, and then leaving with somebody else. I like the idea of wrapping 1 hour of service with intentional thought prior, as one chooses a flower to bring. And then I love the idea of leaving with something tangible, a tangible symbol of our responsibility to each other, our community, our theology, and our responsibility to build a flourishing world. You, Chad, and I have both spoken about a scattered church, which is an idea that the people live their lives of faith beyond the building of the church. They scatter, seeding their theology, seeding love as they go throughout their week. One doesn't become a UU just by attending 1 hour of service or choosing a program they want to attend or a small group. You become a UU by living your faith, by living out our values, which normally hang back here, but Beth is ill. Our values are mindful interdependence, authentic curiosity, and courageous love. None of those are small tasks. One lives as a person of faith, being mindful of the need to ground oneself, to acknowledge that God or the universe or whatever you want to call it is greater than you and me and us, and that we are not the be-all and end-all, and at the same time, to acknowledge that we do have agency and we have responsibility to work towards beloved community where everyone matters, everyone is beloved and safe and cared for. My friend Ruth is doing an internship this year with Daniel Cantor, who serves out of Texas. And some of you may recall a service I did on prayer long ago. There's an article in the UU World that describes Daniel Cantor leading this service on prayer. And after he sort of finished preaching about the concept of prayer, he took a moment and had everybody write something personal or something that they would wish somebody else might hold in prayer for them on an index card. And then it was dropped in a basket during the service. And on the way out, everybody took an index card. He asked them to seriously consider that someone in the sanctuary was asking for their prayers. And so in the writing and in the receiving, to be thoughtful about the exercise that they were engaged in. He's quoted saying, "The switch here was that the ministers weren't going to collect these prayers and say them in church. The people in the pews would take a fellow parishioner's request, contemplate it, and pray over it for a week. Throughout the week, I received several notes and stories about how this had affected those who were present. Some said they felt closer to the church community, knowing the struggle of another in the room. One member said her card was a request to pray for the Palestinians. It happened that her father was a Palestinian, and she spent a week praying for her father. Others said that they got back a prayer eerily similar to the one that they wrote, a prayer for peace, wellness, or family tranquility." He says, "The next Sunday, we asked all who wished to tell us about their experience of the prayer card to write a story about what had happened in the process. One family wrote about how they had arrived at church having just received unwelcome diagnosis for their 5-year-old. We arrived scared and sad and insecure. This card exercises ended up meaning so much to us. Not only did we get to pray for others in our congregation, but someone out there was praying for our sweet child. That night, we went to sleep with a sense of peace." Another member wrote later, "I felt an additional strength to deal with some of my own difficulties because after a week of praying over a card I received, I realized someone has been praying for me." And yet another wrote, "I felt connected to another worshiper and less alone. I knew I wasn't the only one in need of support, and someone else was counting on me to send good thoughts their way. So one of my weekly spiritual practices is around flowers. I've been doing it for years. Every week or so, I buy a bouquet of flowers, kind of like maybe the one far over there. For me, this is a practice of beauty and observing, of attention, and of slowing down. It connects me to my mom, who's online, and my sister, who both have this love of flowers and little delicate things. I take flowers and I take apart the whole bouquet, and then I arrange them in these little vases. I have a cabinet full of little vases, and I choose the right size and color and the width of the neck so that the flower can stand appropriately. I can't tell you the amount of time I spend gazing at these flowers every week. I kind of have my spots I put them in, but it's often. And I can't really even tell you what it does for my spirit, but I think it's really important and transformative, actually. Often I stand there and I literally just am just focused on the delicacy of these flowers, the patterns in each petal, how tender they are, how colorful they are. It sort of feels like a miracle to me, honestly, because I just don't really understand how such beauty emerges from the soil. It's awesome. So I urge you to create some simple practices for yourself, something that you do daily or once a week or whatever, but something that will slow you down and bring some of the qualities of my flower practice. And by grounding ourselves in spiritual practices, that helps us show up as our best selves. It can help us heal some of the brokenness in ourselves. And honestly, when you're grounded, it also makes you kinder and more able to engage in the work of justice making by being a little bit more full than empty. So you can guess that for me, these flowers may act as those prayer cards. We'll talk just a tad bit about that later. But as you know, the flower communion doesn't start and end at this countryside church in Prague. It's actually connected to the life and the death of Čapek, his belief in religious freedom and inquiry, and ultimately his death. I'm currently reading a light little book called Proverbs to Ashes, Violence, Redemptive Suffering, and the Search for What Saves Us. One of the authors was the president of the Star King School of Ministry, which is one of our UU seminaries in Berkeley, California. They argue that Christians need to focus on the Jesus who fought oppression and who moved through his life with love. That's how we as UUs often focus on Jesus, not about his divinity, but more about his actions. His actions of fighting against injustice, acknowledging the need in the world, and working to create a better tomorrow while he was alive. So what does your faith call you to do? What does this connection to this community? A few of you spoke during Joys and Sorrows about what it means to be part of a community that cares. What does it call you to do for each other? In what ways does the story of Norbert Čapek remind you of your freedoms and responsibilities? We are in a super frightening time. And as Susan Frederick Gray, the president of our association, says, this is no time for a casual faith. So engage however you can. And I also get it's really not an easy time to engage. I get that we're weary. This cumulative effect of COVID and witnessing a nation divided is super profound. Couple that with the fact that we've only been meeting here in person since January, and we no longer have a beloved church home that was part of many of your connections to MSUS and the congregation. It's a lot. So returning to the image of flowers, this makes me think of the tenderness of flowers. They are beautiful, and some of them are perennial. They burst forth with a brightness that takes our breath away each spring, and they are delicate. The flower communion reminds us of our own beauty and distinctiveness, and let us remind us of our own vulnerability and tenderness. This community where people somehow miraculously come together, decide to join, where you sit next to and you serve and you come into rooms, virtual or real, with people you may not have chosen to be with otherwise. Here we need not hide, nor be anything other than who we are and who we were meant to be. And that means we come with our own imperfections, our histories and our wounds and our triggers, our biases, our illnesses. Soon, we're going to ask you to choose a flower. Those of you at home hopefully have a flower, and if not, go grab something green, perhaps. When you pick it up, just pay attention to how you hold it, how you handle it with care, how you practice the gentleness that is required with something that is fragile from nature. And as you hold it, remember your own tenderness and that of others. Each of us who look strong on the outside have vulnerabilities and require tender love and care. I hope that we strive to practice that here, knowing that we all have inherent worth and dignity and are deserving of love. So let the flower that you leave with today be a reminder of love, perhaps even of our prayers for each other, and of a world that needs our care.
And now, as we take part in the ritual of the flower communion, we ask that the Spirit of life bless us. Remind us that we meet in fellowship and love. Even though we are all different, we gather as one in love. Let us remember that we are all needed to make this a beautiful world. Those of you who are here in person will each come up in silence and choose a flower different from the one you brought today. We don't need to do this systematically, just come up when you're ready. And when you take one, hold it with care. It is a gift from Mother Earth and someone else here today. If you would prefer that a flower be brought to you where you're sitting, just raise your hand and I will gladly bring you one. And if you're at home, we hope you have a flower nearby you. And if you don't and do have easy access to the outside world, feel free to head out and pick a flower, dandelion, or even a blade of grass, something that represents the world of beauty and nature. So you're welcome to come forward when you're ready, or raise your hand and I will bring a flower to you.